Okay, I suggest we get started. Welcome everyone in here and out there online to this evening's program titled Listening Exercises Towards an Ethics of Silent Resistance. And a warm welcome to our speakers, NIAS fellows Miriam, Rasch and Costica Bradatan, whom I will further introduce after introducing myself in some introductory words. My name is Merlijn Olnon. I am NIAS Manager of Public Affairs and will be your host and moderator this evening. NIAS, or in full, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Sciences, was founded in 1970 and was the third research institute of its kind in the world, after the Institutes for Advanced Study in Princeton and in Stanford. NIAS is devoted to facilitating unrestricted and unfettered research, which oftentimes means research freed from the constraints of funding and employing institutions. Each year we host around 55 researchers from all over the world and from all disciplines who live and work at the Institute and who enrich their research through sharing approaches, insights and findings with each other, striking up professional and often also personal friendships in the process. This evening's NIAS talk is a case in point. You will find before you two philosophers from very different personal and professional backgrounds doing research on quite similar subjects, cynicism and technology respectively, who discovered shared interests in essay writing for a more general audience, as well as in counterintuitive thinking on the tension between autonomy and society, and therefore also on forms and modes of mediation. I'm sure they will correct me on these blunt summarizations over the coming hour. But without further ado, let me now introduce the speakers and outline their program. Costica Bradatan is Professor of Humanities at Texas Tech University and the author of Dying for Ideas with Bloomsbury, published in Dutch as Sterven voor een idee, and last year in Praise of Failure with Harvard University Press. Costica is also the philosophy and religion editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books, and writes regularly for such venues as the New York Times, Washington Post, TLS, Literary Review, Commonweal, and Aeon. Miriam Rasch is a philosopher and writer. Her books are Zwemmen in de Oceaan, sorry for the Dutch, Berichten uit een postdigitale wereld, Enterprise-winning Friction, Ethiek in tijden van dataïsme, both with the bezige bij, and Autonomy, een zelfhulpgids, Autonomy, a self-help guide, with Prometheus. Our program will be straightforward. We plan to have talks of 10 to 15 minutes by first Costica and then Miriam, followed by some discussion between them, which we will eventually open up for the audience. We intend to wrap up somewhere between 9:15 and 9:30 so that we have some time left for drinks, for which you are all cordially invited. Before I call Costica to the stage, there is one last thing I should add, and that is that Miriam and Costica, and how can they not in view of their subject, expressly invite you to join in making their reconnaissance of the meanings, modes and outcomes of silent resistance as collaborative an effort as is possible, and to not hesitate to join in with questions. Okay, Costica, may I invite you to the stage?
I will be speaking for some 10 minutes, and then we'll discuss later. Except for a painful one-year stint as a high school teacher of philosophy in his native Romania, Emile Cioran, or Cioran, if you know him by his French name, never had a real job. I avoided at any price the humiliation of a career, he said later in his life. I prefer to live a parasite's life than to destroy myself by keeping a job. When he chose to move to France in 1937, it mattered to him that Paris was, I quote, the only city in the world where you could be poor without being ashamed of it, without complications, without dramas. Like his ancient predecessor, the cynic Diogenes of Sinope, Cioran turned his poverty into a badge of philosophical honor. For the most pressing needs of his body, he would rely on the kindness of strangers and the generosity of friends. He wore other people's hands-me-down clothes or entertained them with his wit or an erudition in exchange for a meal. He would do anything except take a proper job. Doing nothing in a world where everybody seems busy doing something, anything, struck Cioran as the only lifestyle worth pursuing and defending. A life devoid of action and practical ambition, of distractions and business, is a life in which room has been made for meaning. I'm quoting from him again. Anything good comes from indolence, from our incapacity of taking action, executing our projects and plans, he wrote. And he behaved accordingly. When a journalist once asked him about his daily writerly routines as a writer, his answer was candor itself. I quote, "Most of the time I don't do anything. I'm the idlest man in Paris. The only one who does less than I do is a whore without clients." Cioran may have been joking, but his idleness was serious business. It was an arduous lifetime project into which he put the best efforts and which he served with complete dedication. He took up this path not out of some particularly lazy dispositions, but because of his unquenchable thirst for knowledge and understanding. To do nothing at all is the most difficult thing in the world. The most difficult and the most intellectual, Oscar Wilde observed decades before Cioran. If we are to understand the world, we have to stop acting upon it. We have to contemplate it. Contemplation and action are sworn enemies. Doing nothing brings forth an angle from which to look at everything with cosmic detachment. Idleness breeds depth of vision and a truly philosophical perspective. Cioran gained his greatest insights not from books or fancy schools, but from walking aimlessly around Paris and from his nights of atrocious insomnia. He didn't learn philosophy from his professors, but from his conversations with beggars, drunkards, and sex workers. Walking in the footsteps of other great idlers of the contemplative tradition, think of Bartleby or Oblomov, Cioran was in a good position to explore the vast expanses of nothingness that precedes our coming into being and which follows it. Looking the void in the face is an all-consuming job, even as he was jobless for most of the time. Having thus received the revelation of the universal insignificance, as he put it, Cioran decided that the best possible social existence would be a parasite's life, a loser. In a meaningless world, he observed, I quote, "Only one thing matters, learning to be a loser. Embracing loserdom, making the most of it, becoming one with it, became the great project of his life." Cioran aspired to be a loser as single-mindedly and passionately as others aspire to make a name for themselves in business, academia, or politics. For he realized early on in his life that loserdom puts us in the best position to understand how society works and how it can surreptitiously turn our sociality into a form of self-enslavement. Most important of all, loserdom gives us the key to life's best guarded secret. At its core, the world, and we in it, is nothing but a failed project. Let me elaborate. We we fail all the time in things large and small, yet our biggest failure may be that, as a rule, we don't understand failure. And since we are not equipped to think about it, we cannot grasp its broader significance in our lives. A long evolutionary history has hardwired us to go blindly for whatever increases our chances of survival in the world, and therefore to chase immediate success, brooding over failure, just as brooding over our finitude and mortality doesn't improve our chances of survival. Failure is a sudden eruption of nothingness in the midst of existence. And contemplating nothingness while spiritually enlightening doesn't make much evolutionary sense. That's why when failure happens, and it happens all the time, we instinctively tend to move on without paying much attention or studying it in any depth. This must be one of failure's sweetest victory over us. On a deep level, we are designed to fail, and to fail badly, including our final failure, physical annihilation. And yet, we are conditioned to remain blissfully unaware of failure's darker message, because our thinking doesn't come to terms with it, cannot come with it, just as our thinking cannot come to terms with death itself. Take the Beckettian quote about about failing better, which self-help gurus, entrepreneurs turned spiritual masters, and other life hackers repeat with abandon. Nothing is easier, if you listen to these sages, than to stumble upon spectacular achievements after experiencing disaster. On this view, failure is always pregnant with fulfillment, like a quarrel between lovers, which makes their eventual reconciliation all the sweeter. A little trick meant to spice up an already grand relationship. What these people always fail to mention, however, is what comes right after their favorite failure quote. For there is, for Samuel Beckett, something even better than failing better is failing worse. Going down and going under, capitulation, looking for an exit, expiration. Here's the larger context of his novella, Worst Word, Ho, which, as a rule, is conveniently left out. I quote from Beckett, "Try again, fail again, better again, or better worse, fail worse again, still worse again, till sick for good, throw up for good." Failure doesn't necessarily lead to success, but to even more failure, abject, painful, unbearable failure. Did I mention that Beckett was Turan's friend? "Amidst your ruins, I feel at home," Beckett wrote to him once. Now, this sugarcoating of failure is part of a larger societal process. Everything that is unpleasant, disturbing, depressing in our culture is neutralized, sterilized, and promptly taken out of view. Not so much for mental health reasons, as for economic and social ones. For to be productive members of society, to be able to make large amounts of money and to spend even more, to take loans and to pay them back with interest, we need to be hooked to a positive outlook. Capitalism doesn't thrive on loners, depressives, or metaphysicians. No respectable bank will lend money to a client today who may snap and go Henry David Thoreau tomorrow. Navel gazers can be dangerous elements, and so can philosophical nihilists. Should their numbers be left unchecked, they could undermine even the most industrious of communities. That's why such unsocial tendencies need to be watched closely and weeded out as needed. An impressive army of therapists well-being coaches, yoga instructors, and self-help experts, entertainers, educators, entrepreneurs, and other charitable souls is deployed to make sure that we don't ever stumble upon the dark side of existence, let alone look the void in the face, as Choran used to. This is problematic even when it comes to us through the mediation of art and literature. The great books that explore the abyss of the human soul, the mediocre ones never go there, now come with trigger warnings. Inhaling serious literature is apparently as dangerous as smoking. Granted, this sugarcoating industry has turned life in modern society into a highly artificial affair and largely a mockery, but most people don't seem to mind. For mindlessness is another important dimension of modern life. Such is Choran's savage wisdom, or could have been. You cannot miss the irony. If you are to listen to him, he could, I quote, could not do anything serious all his life. And yet, in his books, he offers some of the most serious insights into the alienated condition of modern life, under which we all labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjolein and Costica. Yes, so two philosophers on the stage, so we start with reading from paper. That's just the way it is, I guess. It's already quite some time ago that I engaged in a personal project called The Human Cat. I would deliberately fail as a human being, and I was well underway without a regular job or boyfriend, and only a humanities master to vouch for me. But I would succeed as a cat. The project was meant both as a critique of the system, which I just couldn't crack at the time, and as a way to grant myself some deserved rest and relaxation. So doing nothing as a form of protest, it sounds like a win-win situation. First things first, though, I registered a website address. And in my mind, the human cat started to grow into a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, with a diary, pictures, videos, and eventually an artist book. But it came to nothing. I abandoned the whole thing quite quickly, without so much as a purr, so to speak. I didn't have time to fail. There was rent to pay and insurances, not to mention the cat food for my furry friend that lived with me. So, in a sense, this project was a perfect flop, since the doing of nothing came to nothing. Some years later, however, I ended up writing about my failed attempt at becoming a cat. I wrote an essay. It was subsequently published in a book, and that really completed this circle of failing at failure. I set out to do nothing, didn't manage to do that, but then I put it in a book. So look, now it was something, a venerable critique. And it's a paradox that haunts me ever since. How can you do nothing and still be able to talk about it? How does one step outside of this productivity cycle and then report on it? So how do you escape this contradiction of failing and subsequently succeed to tell about it? I mean, Choran was a published author that we still read in many translations as well. Okay, since the humancat.weblog.com, the world hasn't slowed down a bit, and doing nothing and failing to take part, refusing to be co-opted by the system, is a form of protest that feels even more urgent now, even for a somewhat successful professional, as I in the end turned into. I didn't see it coming. We're constantly pushed to speak up, share our opinions and accomplishments, our looks, our food, our cat also online, I mean. And opting out mostly harms yourself. Invisibility nowadays is a very high price to pay, because who will read your latest article if they don't circulate online? And if your friends don't see you regularly in their feeds, how will they remember that they still care about you? The constant drive towards productivity and self-expression really only deepens the need for seclusion, at least for me. I've always considered myself as more of the kind who would end up roving the desert alone, searching for revelation, than joining a revolution with a bunch of comrades. I can genuinely long for a life like Sister Bradatan. She was a nun from 15th century Utrecht who had a cell built for herself in a church and spent 57 years there enclosed in stone. And at the same time, as a writer and philosopher, it feels a bit deceptive to say that you want to be or are a loser. Because don't we all have something to say and write books? There's this weird internal drive to contribute. I just can't help myself. And let's be honest, I just spent 5 months sitting in some kind of cell at NIAS writing a book about not wanting to engage, which is an irony in itself. But even Sister Bradatan was a published writer, and apparently she had a lot of visitors coming to her cell, seeking advice or just a listening ear. So that brings me to the question of this evening. What are alternative ways of engaging, let alone resisting, without engaging too much and churning out critiques of productivity as if one was indeed a productivity guru seems a bit contradictory. And as we know, critical alternatives are usually made to fit the system quite fast. Mindfulness is co-opted by capitalism, yoga is offered by your health insurance, and space to play is by now part of Silicon Valley architecture. The praise of doing nothing, I'm afraid, is readily enclosed in itself by the neoliberal regime that we live and work in. Then, indeed, it becomes a project in its own right, with goals and results, God forbid, project leaders. So the tough question is it even possible to do nothing outside of the system and then to make it known to the world? Or is that not really necessary for it to count as engagement and resistance? So that's a lot of questions, and I want to make 2 remarks as a beginning of answers. So first, I'd like to turn over the word project. Doing a project, I think, is inherently productive. You project something into the future. And in our time, that goes with targets, milestones, and plannings. Sartre pointed out even our human life is a project, and I'm a Sartrean, so I say this as a friend of his. Our human life is a project, or it should be, where we thrust ourselves forward into the future, becoming who we want to be in all our freedom and responsibility. So that sounds very well, but it also makes me tired just hearing that. So as a small step forward, I propose the word practice over project. A practice has an artistic ring to it, which I like, but most importantly, it has no end. If you fail, even if you fail at failing, you wake up the next day and start practicing again at failing, for better or for worse. And instead of drawing up another self-centered project with a website attached to it, although to my defense, the Human Cat was a project from pre-Facebook age, these practices of withdrawal can be stumbling and stuttering forms of resistance, where even the word resistant should be used hesitantly because it's about withdrawal. So a practice is always imperfect and dirty, but also something you can pick up anytime, day by day, like learning a language or playing the piano or doing yoga or mindfulness. Second, for the past couple of years, and especially the past couple of 5 months, I've been working on the theme of listening. So I believe that listening is an example of a practice that combines the need for seclusion and for engaging. At first glance, listening seems to be passive, a retreat into silence, maybe even a submission, like when people say, you have to listen to me now. But I've come to understand it really as a third thing, a thing that breaks up the binary of being silent and speaking up, of activity and passivity, of retweeting into a stone cell in a church or joining a revolution. Something with Simone Weil that is a passive activity. Because once you start practicing your ears, you'll find that it's a special type of doing something, despite this need to stay silent. Although I suspect that staying silent is a really active practice for a lot of people. So, to be sure, listening is co-opted as well. I've seen many examples of it. Politicians who again and again promise to listen to the people. CEOs who claim to have changed around their whole business by simply listening to their employees, because when you listen to your employees, they're going to work harder. And I've come to think of this as performative listening, listening as a project with its own targets, goals, and milestones. But that's not the listening that I'm after here. Because what happens when you listen in this passive-active way is that a relationship unfolds between what is listened to and yourself. So, be it with another human being, the birds, the ocean, or this voice that we all have within ourselves. And that relationship isn't static or neutral. Pauline Oliveros, who is a composer, she developed the practice of deep listening. She calls this the listening effect. Listening, even if it's done in silence and without so much as a gesture, changes the world, or has the ability to change the world. And the world, in return, changes you back. So when you're listening, you're on the receiving end, and at the same time, an actor. And being on the receiving end sounds a bit like a failure or something for a loser, something that doesn't usually count as desirable. But I wonder if it could be a position that actually turns doing nothing into a form of resistance. So that is my proposal for a discussion, and I'm really curious to hear what you all have to say. Thank you.
So, Costica, we agreed that we would ask you to respond to Miriam first, if you would like to.
I think there are several ways to respond to Miriam's provocation, one of which, the most tempting one, perhaps, is to do nothing, just to prove that doing nothing is possible. She complained that it's... But I'm going to agree with her that there is something problematic about the very idea of doing nothing. My response, my proposition is to see the word nothing in a broader, more complex way. Strictly speaking, doing nothing is impossible. We do something always, do something. Even when we sleep, we snore, we breathe. Even when we die, we do something, we are rotting. I mean, there is always something going on. Doing nothing, strictly speaking, logically, is impossible. But to go back and be a bit more serious, my understanding of doing nothing doesn't involve doing nothing. It involves a certain type of attitude. Somebody who does nothing in that sense does quite a lot, moves around, walks, writes, thinks, but doesn't do something practically useful, doesn't do something economically profitable, doesn't engage in business, doesn't want to change the world. That person withdraws into a type of existence where contemplation comes first. So what I had in mind basically is the contemplative tradition. It's not so much today. The distinction is not clear. We talk about the production of knowledge, the higher education industry, I think, if you listen to some administrators, you'll hear the higher education industry, or and so on and so forth. But back then in the ancient times, or in other cultures, the distinction was quite clear. There was the contemplative life and the practical life, vita contemplativa and vita activa. There was a clear, you had to make a choice. And similarly, in ancient India and many other places, there are two approaches to the world, to existence, two understandings, different understandings of what it is to be human. So in that respect, in that way, I'm using doing nothing. And also, we have to keep in mind, it's really what I was describing a bit ironically, a bit half joking, is an ideal situation. Is some kind of, I am personally a workaholic, but I dream of doing nothing in the way in which a sinner dreams of sainthood. I know it's possible. I know it's somewhere there. One day, perhaps, we can hope. We can always hope. So that doing nothing in this sense kind of can inform our lives, can sometimes make us stop, slow down, take a different, stance. I will say more. I don't want to monopolize.
It reminds me of something you were just saying, actually, before we got here. What is the point of listening we were discussing? What is the goal? This is, of course, taboo in this discussion, a word like goal, but what is the point?
I would say also, listening to your comment, the goal is to step out of the logic of always having to have a goal, or having to always make something productive in the dominant sense of the world where we live in here in the West. And I think one of the big problems is that even it's much harder to do nothing, even in the sense that you just described, because even when I'm mindlessly scrolling on my smartphone, which may give me relaxation, I'm working for the big tech companies, And that's like this problem with the mindfulness and the yoga. Even if I'm practicing mindfulness, it's very hard to silence the little voice in your head that says, it will keep me from my burnout, or, to think, this makes me healthy and it's important to be healthy. So this whole logic of productivity and always having to do something with a goal in mind is probably, the biggest obstacle to doing nothing in the contemplative sense. And listening might be a way to kind of start practicing that. I really think that listening, not like the CEO or the politician, is precisely something that you do without knowing what you get out of it. Because if you already knew, you didn't have to listen for it. So it's a very, a very open-ended, non-directive thing to do, which is hard because then you also don't know if it's time well spent. All your time has to be well spent nowadays. So I guess that is one of the biggest issues why we're probably also both working on this topic and talking about it, that it's really hard to get out of the logic of always having to do something, even if you do nothing. It's because it will give you rest so that you can start doing again.
There's a problem with activity, I think. Activity, that's where activism comes from. And, or not a problem, but we have to always see it within the pair and see the significance behind. And if you study different spiritual traditions, activity is a sign of imperfection, of insufficiency, of a sign that you need something. I move, I act when I need something, when I need to prove myself, when I need to... Something that's perfect is still, doesn't do anything, doesn't move, doesn't... God is itself is still. Everything else is moving around, and because that's the sign. That's what imperfection is all about. You need something. You aspire. You miss something. You need food. You need some to reach some kind of complete state, and so on. There is always this dynamism, and that's activity. So in ancient philosophy, in Indian philosophy, passivity, including listening and so on, is a higher form, is a higher quality, and it's something to be looked for.
I'm curious to learn from you. So you both discussed this just now. You are both working and are now on a stage, and you are writing and you're teaching. So obviously you don't want to be totally silent. So what for you is the ideal mix? I mean, you apparently want both. You want to be in the world and not of the world. And at what moments do you need to be in the world, for what purposes? And at what times you don't want to be in the world, and for what purposes?
Well, you can. That's a really good question. You speak. We should try to speak when we have something to say. To say something, not just to make noise. I think that's. If you speak just to make noise, to attract attention and so on, that's not. That's a sign. Again, it's something you. It's a sign that you are not well. You are not in a good place. So it's a matter of economy, of simplicity. It's we should get rid of all the background noise, the extra noise, unnecessary stuff around. The best writings are, there is a silence in a good piece of writing. There's something simple, clear, clean, silent there. And the message comes across really powerfully because there's nothing else. It's this simplicity. And that's what, at least myself, I aspire to. To get rid of all that's unnecessary. That's background noise. That's useless.
Yeah, I must say I also very much like being active. So it's indeed about balancing it out. And then there's the question of the sinner aspiring to sainthood while, of course, knowing you'll never get there. So it's good to have this kind of example of how life can be otherwise. And it's not so much that we should all aspire to being perfect, because we're human beings. We can't be perfect ever, if you ask me. So, but doesn't mean that you can't have an example of what could be possible. And that brings me, I guess, to another point, which is that for me it's not so much about simplicity and shedding all the unnecessary stuff, although it sounds really nice, but it's also about breaking through habits that are imposed on you by the outside world and that you didn't necessarily choose for yourself and also don't really subscribe to. So I think a lot of stuff that we're doing, also like speaking up, voicing opinions, sharing stuff on LinkedIn and Instagram, go on about that. It's really something that has become automatic behavior. And I very much like to break through these automatic behaviors. Of course, we need a lot of automation in our lives, otherwise you perish immediately. But I think a lot of these maybe it's also a lot of the unnecessary hassle has to do with automated behavior, and to somehow kind of first see that for what it is, and then just to stop taking part. That would be my my small step towards.
So it's not a radical program. It's basically at any time you feel like you can just.
I don't know.
Doing one thing and perhaps start doing it again later on, but
it's a question of what you call radical. So, I think, for example, really good listeners. I don't call myself a really good listener because it's really hard, and it can be really radical to really listen very well, not just to other people with opinions outside of your own bubble, but also to nature or to. Just sounds, experimental music. There's so much to listen to, and it can be very radical to open yourself up to what is out there and let it in and try to engage with it. So, and I mean, Costica, you're not on social media at all, I believe. That is quite radical. I mean, it's a question. It doesn't come across as I'm on the barricades and picking up arms, but to really step out of this automated demands that are being made of us. It's radical in its own little silent, somewhat passive kind, because it's about not being there instead of being there. So, do you consider yourself a radical in that sense?
I'm just trying to be myself. I don't know the name.
He doesn't want to have a program.
Life without principle, yeah.
Okay. So then you say you're talking about listening, and listening also involves the world around you. So what then is your practice? If a catastrophe is obviously nearing, and I don't know, political, cultural, wars even, do you want to stay silent, period, or do you want to stay silent until a certain point? So my question, I guess, is I'm not really convinced that there isn't some politics in there, except from the radical politics of not wanting to speak or to listen. Could you reflect on that? Do you have an opinion on this?
It's a question that is very pertinent and that also kind of haunts me, to be honest, because you kind of pose the question as if this is something of the future, while according to my own opinion, we have plenty catastrophes already kind of up here right now. Yeah. And no, I don't think you can stay silent always until the end of time. But I do think that there is not just one way of engaging with a catastrophe like that. So again, to name this kind of automated behavior where we go online and share our feelings or our concerns or petitions or, I don't know, all these things that happen within the framework of big tech, just to name it like that, it's the easiest. That, for me, no, I don't want to feel urged or obliged to do that. I think there should be other ways of first contemplating, shedding the rubbish, and then speaking up, maybe in a more determined or well thought out way, or even saying, I don't know what we should do. So this is also like it's not just about the praise of failure or hesitance or listening, but it's also indeed practicing it. So saying, what are the limits of my knowledge? What are the limits of what I think we can do if someone pushes me to give an answer to a question like that? To say, like, this is something that haunts me at night. It's really true, and I don't have the answer to it. And I think if we could all be a bit more open about these kinds of doubts or hesitances, that would already be a very important step, even if it doesn't win the war or help drive off catastrophes.
Excellent, thank you. A lot depends on context. There are times and places when to say something, anything could be politically brave. If I am right now in Russia and say something against Putin, just one word is brave, is something. Makes a huge difference, and also I risk a lot. I can go to prison, I can lose my life. If I'm here and I say something against the government, nothing happens. So sometimes when all around you there is a crowd voicing basically the same thing, and expressing perhaps common but wrong views, staying quiet in that context may be politically meaningful, politically brave, because the mob, the crowd around where you find yourself pushes you to say something and you don't. And that can be. So it's either one, speech or silence can be, depending on the context, can be politically meaningful. I'm very interested in the topic. One of the books you mentioned, Dying for Ideas, is about philosophers who, in repressive regimes, have to make a point, and everything they say becomes politically meaningful. And you have people like Jan Patočka in 1977 in Czechoslovakia who didn't say a lot, but the little he did was enough to attract the attention of the regime. And he soon after he lost his life. Socrates was not saying much, but he was asking questions, and he was not keeping quiet. But others would be pushed to say something, to express allegiance to a tyrant or something, and they would keep quiet. And that silence was political, and maybe could be the end of them.
Does democracy allow for such meaningful silence? Because you're talking about autocracies.
Right. It's everything. So I wrote that book some years ago. It came out 10 years ago, and at the time I thought, and I was in places like this. I was asked questions. I thought, well, what I'm talking about is the past. Those things happened, and we live in a different place now. And then soon after, history changed, and we had a number of regimes all around the world, autocratic regimes, and more or less, and where suddenly, unfortunately, my book became relevant. I remember launching the book in Turkey, and there was something, visibly political in the audience. But even democracy, I mean, we've learned over the last few years how fragile democracy actually is as a political system, including in the States, including in the West. And you never know. And you may not lose, if you speak against certain people, Trump or whatever, you may not lose your life today, but you get into other kind of trouble. But who knows what happens in 10 years, in next year.
We're looking forward to it, yes. I'm wondering if there are any questions from the audience that we should be taking at this point. Don't hesitate, yeah.
So I have a question. Do I need to introduce myself? Yeah, so Alexander, and I have a question. We always mention and pronounce the word saying, but saying assumes saying to someone, to whom and for what sake, to be visible, to be present, and I also think that it all comes from cult of fear of death, as it was in Cicero, for example, in his discussions, and as fear of death is classified. So we want to be present, we want to be remembered and not forgotten. And our society presents this dogma and these values to us in the form of democracy, in the form of capitalism and its values and its goals. So saying to whom and for what?
Saint to whom?
Yeah, saying to whom.
Well, I think it's, by saying to them, there is a pretty clear understanding. We are operating within a religious context. It's a saint is somebody who, within a given religion.
Saying to whom? Saying, talking to
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
We are talking about being silent and saying something, but to whom?
Sorry. Yes, good question, because there are different audiences, different layers of the same audience. Which is shifting. Saying to whom? Typically it's a matter of power, right? That's where the spoken word can be dangerous, can be powerful or risky. You're speaking truth to power, right? It can get you in prison. It can get you killed if it's a tyrannical regime. It can get you ignored if it's a democratic regime. Nothing happens, and that's perhaps the tragedy, the irony of the whole thing, right? You cannot imagine how powerful books are in a dictatorship. As it happened, I grew up under a totalitarian regime, and the written word, books, including samizdat books, were extremely, extremely powerful. And the regime, including now Putin and so on, seem to have been afraid of books. Today here... Oh, you are from Russia. Today here, you write everything, you publish everything, nobody cares. And yet we do prefer democracy. That's the trade-off. You want freedom and irrelevance, or on the other hand, or you want relevance and danger. I cannot solve the problem. I'm just trying to sketch something.
Yeah, maybe to add a little bit the technological perspective, I guess, because it's an interesting question. It made me think about how all the opinions and saying that we do nowadays is, of course, a lot in the digital realm, where you kind of speak into the void, right? But not the void that we have to stare into if we want to be true philosophers, but you think you speak to a very large audience, possibly everyone. But on the one hand, I think, of course, that is a myth, because not everyone follows you unless you're Kim Kardashian or something. And the other thing that is becoming clear, of course, is that we speak to our own bubbles. So the filter bubble is a bit of a myth in itself, but I guess it is true that usually if you communicate online, you do that with like-minded people mostly. So there's also, on the one hand, we have this idea that we speak to the world, and it's actually our own world that we speak to, which isn't bad necessarily, I think. It's also why it works, social media. But I think to come back also to the context, that also is, of course, something that is an interesting factor, because the context can change also very quickly. So if you say something and then there's a regime change, you see it a lot, newly appointed politicians, for example, here in the Netherlands, so in a democracy, and there's some digging into their Twitter accounts and so on, and then some old tweets are being unearthed and it has, a racist saying or something, banal or whatever. And the people are being put up as easy target for online trolling. So it's kind of like, what is this saying? I guess that's why I would also prefer just writing books. But who reads books? That's not a problem nowadays. So I don't know if that answered a little bit.
Yep, or go ahead. I can also save it till later. My name is Femke. For the past 2 years, I've proudly called myself a listening practitioner. I'm an artist, sound artist. I've met Miriam actually last year at Strijp, which was a listening, or which had listening as its theme. I think I just want to confront you with my own notion of listening, and I would like you to respond to it. So for me, listening is very much a call to action. It's something that Pauline Oliveros, that you mentioned before, also said. And for me, the silent resistance is actually what comes from that listening. So it is very much an act of doing. So can we then maybe come to the notion, if we come towards an ethics of silent resistance, saying, come to a conclusion that it's not something that is doing nothing, but that the silence is actually an action.
Yeah, and you mean that the call to action comes from the listener? From
the listening, but then
yes,
the silence also is not doing nothing. The silence is a very conscious choice, and then thus becomes an act of doing.
I would indeed say that's also a little bit what I wanted to point to with this active passivity or passive activity, where it seems like an absence of something, but it's more than just an absence. It's also a presence of something else. Only it escapes our, current system of noticing presences or making them into something valuable. Because to make value out of something, it has to be tangible, and you have to be able to trade it and see it and count it and stuff like this. But I definitely think that the silence or the being silent, zwijgen, that these are very filled presences, indeed. Do you agree?
I do agree, but I don't have much time.
So, because it's an absence in a world that is full, right? Or it's a space you create. So that's the resistance.
Yes, but no, we call it an absence because we're so driven by this logic of commodification and measurability and being able to point to stuff. If it's not there, then it doesn't count, And we talked earlier about how this logic or the language of productivity, it's gone into every little corner of our lives and what we do, that you can hardly step out of it. So I would say, no, it's not an absence, it's a presence, only it's a presence in a different way than we are accustomed to thinking about it or something.
This is what you said earlier, Costica, that we have no language for this. This is what you're talking about now. Okay.
Hi, my name's Linda. I have a question, but the last sort of discussion reminded me of the sort of contemplative Buddhist idea of doing by non-doing, that, action can come out of non-action, but that's a sort of a sideline. My question was for Miriam about listening. At the end of your talk, you quoted somebody, I don't remember who, and you said that listening has the ability to change the world, which is quite a statement, and it's not quite clear to me exactly how. So I thought maybe you could expand on that a little.
Yes. It's actually funny that Costica and I were talking over lunch at NIAS and both acknowledging that we, in the end, aspire to be a Buddhist. So that was a good association that you had there. So that was Pauline Oliveros, the listening effect. And actually, she goes quite far. She has this little book, and it's called Quantum Listening. So she goes into quantum theory, where, the particle on one end of the world communicates in some weird manner with a particle on the other hand of the world, and the one changes and then the other changes as well. But that's merely the metaphor to talk about quantum effect. And I've been thinking about this as well. Like, do I really believe this? And I do believe it, first of all, when it comes to other people. So, of course, you can listen to all these different things, but let's just start with other people. And if you really listen to someone, or let's say maybe you've had an experience once where someone really would listen to you, oh my God, that's quite something, because it doesn't happen very often. So a relationship is established, and it changes how you see yourself, for example, or how you see the other person. And it's nice if that happens to you, if someone listens to you, but that's also something you can do to someone else if you are a good listener. So does it translate outside of human-human relations? And I think to some extent, so then there's other living creatures, so listening to animals. Yes, I do really think if you listen to animals really well and you learn how to do it, you can change the relation that you have with them. So it's a change in the world. Maybe also if you listen to your garden, so then we get out of the auditive listening, but this is deep listening. Huh? So the deep listening goes deeper than the ear. If you listen to your garden, something happens in the garden. And who knows, maybe this goes for other things that grow, even more into the anorganic. I don't know. I'm also still like a rationalist, but I wouldn't kind of want to shut out the possibility. So that's kind of how you can understand, I think, this listening effect. And then how far you take it, yeah. You want to add?
I don't know the context of that quote, but I love it. And I just listening to what was going on, I came to think that listening can really change the world, in the sense that deep, profound listening is a form of humility, and that's unnatural. We are born not to be humble. We are assertive. We are fighting. We are, always trying to impose ourselves upon the others, to gain something, to do something, to hurt. I mean, it's biological. We are pre-programmed biologically not to listen. We listen when we need something pragmatically to gain something and so on. But that kind of listening, as humility, is transformative in the sense that if I were to learn how to listen properly to the other and manage to kill my self-assertive instincts, I may become a different person. And if the next person does the same thing, and then the next person does the same thing, we may end up with a different society. But of course, that's utopian.
That's a revolution.
A silent revolution.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Douwe. I'm a project manager, so thank you.
Been there.
Been there, yeah. I'm going to change that soon. During the talk, I had to think a little bit of a book I recently read by Barbara Stock, who is a Dutch writer and a philosopher, and wrote a really nice graphic novel about the first Greek philosopher, female philosopher, Hipparchia.
a Stoic, and some of the things that you are talking about reminds me very strongly about the Stoicism movement. In the book, Hipparchia renounces her luscious life, her richness, because she sees that all the striving for richness only makes other people feel really miserable. So you should stop trying to be rich because it's only on the backs of other people. So it had a very instrumental reason also to become a Stoic and live a very modest life. And I was thinking and I had to think of another little story that I was thinking in the age of AI, something that I think you're talking about a lot as well, Miriam. We are developing a machine that is basically very capable of chattering and talking a lot and not really capable of listening. So, we have now OpenAI that allows people who have nothing to say even to talk all the time because they can just let the ChatGPT generate stuff. And so we really don't have a need to listen to each other anymore. And following these two examples, so either you can choose to become a Stoic as an instrumental way to denounce, the world that's so damaging, or could it be that you are choosing to listen because you want to carve out like this fundamental human space in our world, to be different than a machine that can only chatter but not listen. Is it intrinsic value to listen, or is it an instrumental thing that you need to denounce the world, if I'm making myself clear?
I think you know more about the Stoics than I do, but about AI, yes, for me, it's also about carving out the space of the human in an increasingly technological age, definitely. But of course, there are also now many apps and chatbots which listen to you. So they provide online therapy or stuff like this. I don't think they really work. And probably because... at least in my view, this non-performative, goal-oriented listening always has to be open to the unpredictable. So the open-endedness, that which can't be filled out beforehand, which is all these things that algorithms can't do because they are programmed to perform certain actions and tasks, and even if they come up with unpredictable results, it's just unpredictable to us, but it's not in essence unpredictable. So yeah, I think for me, but that's more my personal motivation is to go after this human unpredictability, which I think we really need, because technology isn't going to save all these us from all these catastrophes that come our way. Until now, they mostly make it worse. So, and they don't really predict very well for all their predictability. So, we need these other ways of engaging. For me, the core of what we as humans, as listening beings can do is to be open to this unpredictability. So that's for me an important word. But I wouldn't say that Stoics only instrumentalize things.
I don't know the book you are talking about, the Dutch book, but I happen to know a few things about Hypatia. She was a heroess in my other book about dying for ideas. And I'm not sure, she must have listened, obviously, but she spoke. She spoke against Cyril, the patriarch of Alexandria, where she lived. And that killed her in the end. That's a good example of speaking truth to power, because even if she was friends with the governor of the city, Cyril, the patriarch, was even more powerful than the governor, and she ended up being killed by a mob of Christians at a time when, soon after they got power, it was really just the generation before, they were martyrs. And now they were making others into martyrs. They were killing dissenters. She was a pagan. She was not converted. She was a pagan, and she ended up dead. And we don't know much because after she died, all her texts disappeared. And so, typically, history is written by victors. But sometimes there are scraps of paper, there's some, fragments, and some time later, her story was pieced together by other historians, and that's how it's difficult to say, to know for sure what she thought, precisely because she was erased, not just physically, but also the body of her work. After her death, it's a good, a very powerful story and a good example of speaking truth to power, not to political power, speaking truth to religious power.
Hi. So I'm Ting. I'm your colleague, Nia's fellow. So I really like your attempt to collapse the human, non-human distinction. And my question is quite formative. So I think the resistance in the title is really a resistance against the future orientation. I think that is somehow embedded in the argument, right? And for many anthropologists, the future is a navigational capacity that defines human, because only humans have the capacity to plan towards the future, arguably, right? So, to resist against the future, right? It's how should I put it? It's can we? So my question is really, what makes us human if we are to not refuse to project, as in to produce something, because when you produce something, it's always something for the future, right? So what makes us human in that case?
Well, I don't know what makes us human, but this is a very fascinating question, and I completely understand where it comes from, while I think, no, but that's not what I mean, at least. But I talked about the projection into the future and stuff like this. But because it kind of implies that if you resist going into the future, that means that you want to hold back or even go further back into the past, which is the last thing that I would like to do. But indeed, we get a vision of the future which is... so there are many different visions of the future, but the productive vision of the future is just one that I don't really want to subscribe to. And I don't think that should be the only one that we are allowed to have or to imagine or whatever. And there must be different ways of going into the future that do not involve constantly producing things. It's just like, I don't really have a deep opinion about stuff like degrowth or green growth or whatever alternatives there are. But these are also not per se things that or ideas that want to have us go back into the past. They want to have us go into a different kind of future than is being projected at this moment. So that would be my answer. And then, what is human? I always learned that in philosophy that the answer to that is a human is a creature that is born from another human.
Well, I'm not a specialist in the future, but what's fascinating about the future is that it's unpredictable. Anything may happen. When some entity, somebody or some entity is preparing the future for us, that's terrible, I think. Be it a corporation, a government, somebody is preparing, what's going to happen from now over the next 50 years, 100 years, 500 years. That's terrible, because we would rather die now. I mean, what's the point of going through all that if there's no way to change anything? That's why, to go back, what's really beautiful is the future is its sheer unpredictability. The fact that things may happen that way or that way, and anything can happen. And we of course we do have this projective tendency. We always prepare. We project ourselves into the future. We make plans. We take care of stuff. We save money for the future. We have a pension plan, whatever. But it's fine. But when things become a bit too much detailed, that's terrible, because you don't want to live. If you are to live a life, if you live for the rest of your life in a way that's totally prescripted, that's no life at all. That's a form of death.
Yeah, so that brings us back to Sartre and his human life is a project which thrusts forward into the future. Because, of course, he said the point of this project is that the human being is free. So it's unpredictable. Maybe he went quite far in naming this freedom, as in you can do maybe a bit more than is realistically possible. But the notion of the future which is not yet there, it doesn't exist, you know. It's happening in each moment. It doesn't exist. It's only a concept in our minds. And that gives a human being a fundamental freedom and, according to Sartre, a fundamental responsibility to handle the freedom. And I already admitted that I'm a Sartrean, so there's my answer.
I have a proposition about the future. And that is to thrust ourselves towards the drinks. If none of you are protesting, I suggest we do this. There's one protest over here.
Yeah, going back to Sartre.
You do need a microphone.
Going back to Sartre, do you know the definition of play, of a game? It's a magic circle with its own rules and procedures where the outcome is unpredictable and unknown yet and can be shaped. So,
thank you. Thanks, Miriam and Costica, and thank you very much, dear audience, for thinking along and with and against us. Let's talk further over drinks. Thank you.